The following accounts have been submitted by subscribers. These experiences are claimed to describe true events. I ask you to listen in good faith and decide for yourself what to believe. I am 34 years old and live in an older house with my father in northern New Jersey. When we first started renting this place about 1.5 years ago, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That is, until strange things started to unfold one by one. Items misplaced, electronics turning on and off by themselves, the dog acting out of character, and other, scarier things. We've had so many strange things happen since we moved in, it would be impossible to sit and write them all down. The first incident happened about a week or so after moving in. I was home one day by myself, simply washing dishes. I was standing in the kitchen with my back towards the open area of the kitchen and the doorway leading into the living room. There was no one else in the house but me. At least, that is what I thought. You know that feeling you get when someone suddenly walks into a room that you're currently in, or that feeling you get when you feel someone is right behind you. I just could not shake this disturbing feeling. I was in the middle of washing a dish. I felt instantly compelled to turn my head around, only to see no one there. The first 2 or 3 times it happened, I attempted to quietly laugh it off. I would continue washing, but something kept forcing me to turn my head around. It was a feeling I've never felt before. It became so impossible to ignore that I actually got quite spooked. I could feel my eyes resting tightly to the far right of my sockets. I was expecting someone, anyone, to be standing right there behind me with each turn of my head. I thought I was losing my mind. Eventually, I couldn't bring myself to continue what I was doing. I shut off the water, dried my hands and abandoned the sink of remaining dirty dishes. Shutting the door to my bedroom, I sat there, unable to shake the feeling. Of course, at the time I didn't blame this event on anything other than my own imagination. But before too long, other things began to happen in the house that made me question what was truly going on. One day, I accidentally left my phone home for a couple of hours while I was out. This never happens. Being out without my cell phone is like being in public wearing only a shoe. But on this particular day, my phone just happened to be accidentally left on my bed under my sheets and blanket. My father was also at work all day long. My phone and I were happily reunited that evening. Later that night, I was lying in bed and decided to skim through social media and clean out some useless photos and videos. That's when I noticed it. While closing my apps before putting it on the charger before going to sleep, I saw that there was a new entry on the voice recording app. I was a little confused at first. It was the same date as that day. As I hadn't had my phone all afternoon, I knew that I hadn't recorded anything all day. I looked at the timestamp, 1:14 p.m. Recording, 54 minutes and 2 seconds. What? I said to myself. I played it back. I could hear background noise coming from the pavement company's yard down the street. They're very loud while loading and unloading gravel, and after living here, I can't forget that sound even if I wanted to. I knew right away that the recording was coming from inside my own house, but I hadn't been at home at that time. No one was. Except my phone had definitely been here on my bed. I couldn't really make out any interesting sounds on the recording, other than some birds nearby, the house phone ringing once or twice, and the dog barking. I did notice something peculiar though. I thought I heard sink faucets turning on and off inside the empty house. I could even hear the water running for a brief moment. I couldn't find an answer for it. I figured some sort of glitch set it off. Soon, I forgot about it. On another occasion a few months later, I happened to be out of town for work, so my dad was home alone this time. Upon my arrival back in town, I made plans to meet my father for lunch. He was already out of the house running some errands, so I told him I would stop home first, then I would meet him for a bite to eat at a nearby restaurant. When I entered the house, nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. I brought the luggage in and stepped into the bathroom before heading on my way out. I noticed the picture frame that hangs on the wall there besides the sink was standing on the floor below, leaning up against the wall. I brushed it off and assumed it must have fell while I was gone and my dad just hadn't got round to putting it back up. Anyway, I just left it there and decided to wait until we got back home to deal with it. It was about an 11 by 14 sized photo frame, so nothing major. After that, I met up with my dad for lunch as planned. When we were finished eating, I decided to stop at the local grocery store for a couple of things while my dad headed straight home in the other car. As I walked down the aisle in the store, I got a phone call from my dad. This is how the conversation went. "Hi honey, why are the pictures on the floor?" my dad asked. I replied, "Oh, you mean the one in the bathroom? I forgot, I was actually going to ask you about that. I thought you knew about it. It must have fell down off the wall." What my dad said next chilled me. Bathroom? No, I'm talking about the pictures in the living room. I walked through the front door and the walls were empty. That's when I noticed that all 3 living room frames were on the floor. I told him not to touch anything until I got home, because I wanted to see exactly what he was talking about. And sure enough, each frame was on the floor underneath its original spot, neatly leaning up against the wall, exactly the same way as the bathroom picture that I found earlier in the day. Only the frames in the living room were not small like in the bathroom. All 3 of them are very large in size and extremely thick and heavy. One is well over 4 feet wide. Should any of them fall down, just the weight of them alone would shatter all of its glass and cause noticeable damage, either to their frame or to the polished wood floor. But each one was neatly propped up on the floor against each wall. I cannot lift these frames alone by myself easily, and my dad is not the type to even think up a practical joke such as this. He was more annoyed that he had to put them back up. After he and I unsuccessfully tried to figure out what could have caused these to come down from their walls, I went to go to my bedroom to get ready for bed. As I opened the door, I felt a little bit of a struggle. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. When I turned the light on, I saw my long dressing mirror that hangs on the back of the door was in large pieces on the floor. After putting 2 and 2 together, I came to realize the eerie truth that my mirror was also taken down from behind the door and had been leaning up against where it once hung. It had broken when I tried to open the door upon which it rested. What creeps me out the most, even now, is the fact that my bedroom door would have had to have stayed shut for this mirror to have come off and be placed up against it to lean without falling. My windows are locked shut, and no one can reach them from outside as they would just drop to the ground from a higher level. It was as if whoever took my mirror down was still in my room with me. Needless to say, I didn't sleep in my room that night. In the months that followed, it was difficult not to dwell on these inexplicable occurrences and feelings. As I mentioned at the start, these things were only a few of those my father and I have experienced in the house. Each time something happened, it seemed to get creepier and creepier. There are just some things that you will never forget. For me, it was the night I'm about to describe. Somewhat recently, I was asleep in my room. It was about 3 a.m. and I was sound asleep before being woken by a tap on my window. I sat up and leaned over to take a look out of the window through my blinds. There was nothing there. As I was drifting back to sleep, the tapping began again. I opened my eyes again and sat up. There was a girl sitting on the bottom edge of my bed. What happened next was not sleep paralysis. Don't get me wrong, sleep paralysis is a very real and scary thing. I have experienced it multiple times. However, this was noticeably different. I was alert, awake, and able to move. This was real. The girl had to be no more than 11 or 12 years old. She had dark hair just below shoulder length with bangs. She was wearing a nightgown, but you could tell it was outdated from years ago. Ivory coloured, long sleeves, a soft, flat collar around the neck. I could see everything about her in great detail. Everything apart from her face. I know it all sounds so cliché, and I wish I could say it was something different, but that's exactly what it was. She sat there, her head facing directly towards me, but too dark for me to make out any features of her face. I saw nothing but darkness where her eyes, nose, mouth, chin, and cheeks should be. Clearly, however, she was watching me. I was also aware of another, much more mature presence to the right of me, in the direction of where my window was, and the corner of my room where it was very dark. I couldn't even tell if the presence was felt from inside my room in the dark corner or from the window where the tapping first began. I was so scared at that point that I was too afraid to even turn my head in that direction to see what it may have looked like. In all honesty, I was afraid of possibly seeing something that didn't look quite as innocent as this little girl. I do remember quickly glancing across the room and realizing that since the hanging mirror behind my closed door was now missing, its absence eliminated any option of me being able to see the reflection of whatever this second presence was to the right of me. I still tell myself today that maybe it was better that I didn't see it. It was completely silent in my room. No noise whatsoever. Still, I could tell that the two of them were communicating with each other. I could also tell that they were definitely speaking about me. There was nothing physical, no noise or movement that told me a communication was happening. I just knew it. I felt that that girl was not alone and that she was communicating in some unknown way with another entity that was closely present. Of all my experiences, this is something which is very difficult for me to explain to others. I believe that one has to experience it for themselves to truly understand. At the time, my imagination was going wild. What were their intentions? Why were they discussing me? Who are they? I felt a tear roll down my cheek. I couldn't even blink, I was so scared. This young girl sitting on the edge of my bed was absolutely still. No muscle movement, no sign of breath. And she was just barely an apparition. Very real looking. But my eyes were confident that she was not of this realm. All the while, the features of her face eluded me. Only darkness. Yet, she was so focused on me, and I knew that. After what felt like an eternity, she finally made a sudden move which made my heart jump into my throat. Even though I'm not sure whether she was about to stand up or scoot closer to me, I automatically felt threatened in some way, and naturally assumed that she was coming closer. I immediately covered my ears, shut my eyes tight, and screamed, "Stop!" Very slowly, I uncovered my ears and opened my eyes. I could hear crickets again in the backyard, alongside the sound of my own heart beating out of my chest. The girl and the other entity were gone. I turned on the lamp and started sobbing. Currently, my father and I are looking for a new place to rent. Every summer, I go back to my birth country, Japan, to visit my grandmother and the rest of the family with my mother. My grandmother resides on the eastern side of the country and lives in an old and rundown house that she grew up in as a young girl. My gran has a habit of collecting antiques, objects like katanas, vases, kimonos, and geisha dolls. During this particular visit, we were all sitting together in the living room, chatting around the table. My grandmother realized that she had accidentally left one of her katanas out, so asked me to put it down in the basement as she didn't want my little cousins playing with it. As the house was very old, the basement naturally gave me the creeps. The fact that it only had one dim source of light scared me even more. Grabbing the katana and a flashlight, I made my way down the stairs, cautiously moving around the junk that seemed to tower from every corner. As I said, my grandmother has a habit of collecting. Eventually, I found a box to place the antique sword. I turned to leave when I heard a sharp gasp along with a gargle sound. A voice then whispered, "Get out," in my native tongue. My heart dropped and I was frozen in place. I was too petrified to move. The voice sounded like that of a young woman, choking and desperately trying to breathe. My paralysis was broken when I heard heavy footsteps charge and knock over a tall box that was right above me. I instantly ran out of there, slamming the basement door shut as tight as I could on the way out. Returning to the room, some of my relatives gave me odd looks when they saw that I was out of breath and commented that I looked as if I had just seen a ghost. Going to my grandmother, I told her what had just happened. I asked her if she knew about it and if she even believed me. What she said chilled me to the bone. My grandmother smiled and said, "It was my sister trying to say hello." My grandmother had a young sister named Keiko, who had committed suicide in the house's basement after having her heart broken at a young age. She would have done absolutely anything for her boyfriend, but he did not share the same passion. When she found out that he had cheated, she saw no reason to live anymore. I asked my mother how my great aunt had passed, but she wouldn't answer, telling me that I'm only a teenager and don't need to worry about such bad things. After being in the basement, however, I feel like I already know the answer. I assume she hung herself, and the sounds I heard that day were those of her final, tragic moments. Since I was 16, I have had a fascination with the paranormal. I read books and watch videos, eagerly dissecting the stories and cases to see if I can work out whether or not they are real. I guess that is due in part to my own paranormal experience that occurred when I was 18. Some friends and I used to gather around at a bookstore in the evenings every weekend to discuss art and visit cemeteries. During one of these conversations, we learned about an abandoned asylum that is parallel to the biggest cemetery in the area. Naturally, we were intrigued. Putting on our investigative caps, we decided to venture out and check out the cemetery for ourselves. When we arrived at the cemetery, we immediately began smelling something strange. If I had to say what it was, I would say it was sulfur. It sounds cliché, but the smell was strong and coming from the vents under the streets. It could be smelled all across the cemetery. As we started investigating, my friends and I thought it was the beginning of a horror movie. We found broken tombstones, abandoned mausoleums, and very untidy graves. The whole site was a mess. As I began looking around one of the mausoleums, I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched. One of my friends began feeling it too. It was then that we began noticing shadows that seemed to lurk and peek over the tombstones. At first glance, they seemed to be translucent, but once you fixed your eyes on them, they were very black. So black that it was almost as if staring into a pit of darkness. And they were everywhere around us. Far from being a trick of the eye, they could be seen by all of us. No one wanted to walk through them. Some of the shapes were human, but some were not. Some seemed to have horns, inhuman shadows that looked as though if we had touched them, we would not have left that place the same. Their bodies seemed to be slanted and elongated, as if they had once been human, but had changed. These ones were even darker than the others. The whole graveyard was active with shadow entities. By now, the sensation of being watched was unbearable. Not that any of the entities were violent towards us. No, they just observed, watching to see what we were going to do next, to see if we were going to make the wrong move. My friends and I wanted to leave. The final warning was when we saw a child sitting on top of our car. He had a look on his face that told us it was time to go. As we gathered everyone together, we noticed that the car had been pushed from its original place and moved forward. None of us had done this, and it felt like another message that it was time for us to leave the cemetery. Startled, we drove away from the area. Undoubtedly, we had experienced more than we had expected. After a short distance, we were pulled over by a cop. He wondered what we were doing out in that location. After explaining to him why we were there, he began to tell us about the place's history. Apparently, the cemetery had been vandalized countless times, to the point where police had to monitor the area. At once, it made sense to me. It was as though the shadow entities we had seen that night had been watching over their already violated resting places, waiting to see if we would add to the destruction. Hovering over their broken tombstones, once human in form, but now morphed by anger and hatred for the ones who had abused their final resting place. To this day, visiting that graveyard has been the most bizarre paranormal incident I have ever come across. Most of my life I have lived in Russia. When I was a kid, I was surrounded by old fairy tales and stories of pagan origin. TV, books, bedtime stories all spoke of things like Baba Yaga, a witch of the forest that personified the chaotic side of nature, or of Vodinoi, the king of rivers who took drowned women as wives. When I grew up, I realized that these stories weren't always just fairy tales. When it all happened, I was already a young adult with absolutely zero interest in anything but travel and experiencing other cultures. In between my adventures, I returned to Moscow and stayed with my family. It was just me, my mother, and my sister. One day, my mother decided she wanted to move some things around in her room. We moved the bed and placed a closet in its place. We put a big comfortable chair in the corner and moved other bits of furniture and objects as well. It took a while, but her room felt more comfortable afterwards. That night, I stayed up for longer than usual. I was watching something on TV when I suddenly heard a scream. It wasn't a long, horrible sound like in movies. Instead, it was a short yell with a note of fear to it. I hurried to my mother's room. She was there hugging my sister, trying to comfort her. I was told that she just had a nightmare. Thinking that it was normal for a kid her age to have a nightmare, especially after things were moved so drastically in her room, I went to bed myself. It should have ended there, but the next night I was woken up by my sister screaming for a second time. The next night it happened again, then again, then again. My mother is not a very spiritual person. It was my opinion that she blocked her own abilities with certain beliefs and ignorance. But even she was a little taken back when my sister finally managed to explain that every night she was woken up by a giant snake that slithered at her feet. I had been a witness to several paranormal incidents in the past, so I had no problem believing in the possibility of a spirit lingering in our apartment. I waited for a moment when my house was empty, and then walked to the center of it. I spoke up, loud and clear, demanding that my sister should be left alone. If not, I said, I would do everything in my power to clear whatever was tormenting her out of the house. There was no answer. Well, not until the night came. My sister's scream woke me up again. I stood up from my bed, and as I was about to leave my room, my door slammed shut with so much force that the wooden door frame cracked. I opened it, feeling rather angry, and hurried to my family. The same story played out. Only this time, my mother finally admitted that this wasn't normal. She turned to me and asked me to deal with it, somehow. I'm not a religious person. However, to tell you the truth, I did think to call a priest and bless my apartment. But what good would it have done, considering I so strongly believed that their holy water had the same properties as the water we had in the sink? I turned to books, hoping for an answer, but found nothing of use. I asked on the internet, and got 100 comments that told me to believe in Jesus. I started to think that I would find no solution, and that my sister's screaming each night because of a giant serpent at her feet would remain a regular occurrence. Eventually, I did find the answers I needed. Interestingly enough, I found them with a few men that lived outside of Moscow, and only came here for work. They listened to my story and just waved their hands at me. It's a domovoi. For them, it was as clear as day. They didn't have to believe in those things. They lived them. In Slavic folklore, a domovoi is a house spirit. He was mostly considered a good being that helped the owners of the house and protected them. It was also said that if a family angered, he might scare them or even toss things about. I had never considered the possibility, but when I thought about what we might have done to anger the house spirit, I remembered how we had rearranged the apartment. We had rearranged the room that was always the master bedroom in the apartment. I told everything to my mother, and we put everything back in its original place. That night, my sister slept like nothing had ever happened. The next day, I walked back to the center of the apartment and said that if something like that was to happen again, I'd call a priest. Now I realize that I shouldn't have done that. Since then, the only one who has problems with this house's domovoi is me. Every time I come to visit, one item in my possession breaks in a strange way, no matter for how long I stay. I work in a nursing home. The building is really old, and it was destroyed by a fire before being renovated into the home it is today. I work in the kitchen, so I go all over the building offering cups of tea and food to people. Since I started working there, I heard stories of strange things that are said to happen in the home. In particular, there was a story of the spirit of a woman without legs who had supposedly been seen drifting along the corridors, passing through walls. I was not sure if I believed such stories. That was until I started experiencing things for myself. About a year ago now, I was making tea on the middle floor. There was a woman sitting alone in a chair in the lounge where the corridors meet. She was wearing a long purple dress and had dark hair tied up. I began to make her a cup of tea as she sat there watching me. I felt as though I was being judged in a way, that she thought she was of a higher class than me. In a moment I brushed this feeling aside, as the home is very expensive and I work as a student on minimum wage, so many of the visitors to the home do tend to have this attitude. However, the lady didn't even say hello, she just sat there. When I turned to ask her if she wanted sugar in her tea, she was gone. There was no evidence that she had ever been there to begin with. She just disappeared. Since that time, it is like some kind of floodgate has opened, and I have experienced several other strange, possibly paranormal things. The kitchen is in the basement of the home. As it is an L shape, it is impossible to see the entrance from the work area. By the door, there is an area to make drinks. Now, when I say the basement is creepy, I mean that the majority of staff will not go down there alone. As for me, I do work in the kitchen alone, yet I constantly feel like I'm being watched, or that there is someone behind me. I can usually brush the feeling off. That was until recently, when a salt shaker kept throwing itself on the ground from the shelf by the drinks area. Throwing, not falling, throwing itself from the shelf. At first I thought it was a carer messing around, but when I moved the salt to where I could see it, it tumbled off the shelf twice when my back was turned. On other occasions, the box of tea bags has also been thrown whilst I've been there. There is a violence to it, which makes me think that whatever forced through the tea and the salt was trying to hurt me. Sometimes banging and clashing sounds come from the kitchen for no apparent reason, like someone is banging on the surfaces or hitting trays together. The other cooks have said that they have experienced other strange occurrences too. The room gives me the chills. At times I've been so scared that I've genuinely needed an excuse to leave the kitchen. As terrifying as that room can be, however, a more recent experience was scarier still. I believe I have seen another spirit, although this one was clearly malicious. In the morning, the fire door between the corridors is kept closed, as the toaster has the potential to set the alarm off. I was on the middle floor collecting plates from breakfast, and through the door I saw a woman running at me, frantically. She had dark eyes and grey frizzy hair. As strange as it sounds, she looked like what a kid's film may depict as a witch. As she charged towards me, I froze. I was behind the door and I couldn't move. A part of me knew that this lady wasn't a visitor to the home. She was something dangerous, something otherworldly. She didn't make it to the door, but I didn't see what happened to her. Just like the first woman, it was as though she disappeared. After that, I ran down the corridor as fast as I could with my plates, and I didn't go back up for the rest of my shift. After seeing the woman in the purple dress, and now that wild-haired lady, I have become terrified of the middle floor. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for more of the paranormal if you have not done so already. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to share. It helps more than you know. And if you cannot wait until my next video, why not check out another on screen now? Remember, the more you know, the more there is to fear.